So today's guest is Anthony Giannini, who is a cultural anthropologist, and he got his degree from Northern Arizona University. He has studies across comparative religions and altered states of consciousness. He's focused on mystical experiences and shamanism. So, Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Taya. It's my honor to be here.
Thank you. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're an applied anthropologist. What does that mean, and how did you get involved in this line of work?
So, I am a specialist, a cultural anthropologist, and an applied anthropologist. And anthropology is such a big field. And that's really what sparked my interest in anthropology because anthropology is the study of humans. So, really anything that humans do within their culture could be considered cultural anthropology. So we can study all sorts of unique niches and behaviors that people engage in no matter where they're at in the world. So I was really drawn to anthropology because I could essentially research my own interests, which happen to be plant medicine, shamanism, and altered states of consciousness.
So, when you talk about altered states of consciousness, do you focus on psychedelics? Do you what is your focus specifically?
I was looking at universally altered states of consciousness and universally what mystical experience is because I was really interested by many different world religions, how universally different pilgrims or disciples or followers of different religions or spiritual practices report having a mystical experience of some kind where they connect with the deeper level of themselves, they connect with God, or they connect with different spirits. So I was really interested in that and the implications of what that could mean. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion as a researcher that anyone who is in a religion or a spiritual practice, or even spontaneously, if they have a vision or a experience of non-ordinary consciousness, they're really connecting in an altered state of consciousness. So we say that it's an altered state of consciousness or an altered state of reality because it's a unique experience that happens on a different level of awareness than what's considered consensual or cultural reality. So our culture is really refined and defined by the words and the language that we speak. And this gives us context and concepts that we can communicate. But in the essence of spirituality and altered states of consciousness, people are having these experiences which are really defying explanation. And so it happens on a different state of reality. And so that was my interest. And what I found was that the earliest religion or the earliest spiritual practice and really the earliest form of culture on earth in the historical record is shamanism. And that involves people going into caves or going on special journeys in nature so that they can connect more deeply with themselves or what's called the spirit world, which is the unseen world of reality.
So I know Paul Stamets believes that the cultural tradition that comes from Judeo-Christian line really was affected by psilocybin. What are your thoughts on that? And in general, what are your thoughts on the various psychedelics that have been used throughout history by different cultures?
That's a really big and broad question. There's so many different contexts in which people have taken different forms of psychedelic medicine. And it's deeply tied to their origin religions or their identity as a people. A lot of these cultures that have been around for thousands of years that utilize different plant medicines, these medicines are intrinsically tied into their creation myths or their legends of their own tribal and personal identity. So it's a really rich topic for cultural study because we find that a lot of these plant medicines are pillars of practice in any given culture. And there's a lot of different strange and bizarre theories out there some of which may be true, some of it we just may never know. For example, Terence McKenna has the stoned ape theory, where he says that humans, early humans, pre-anatomically modern humans were walking around on the plains of Africa and eating psilocybin mushrooms, and it kind of inspired them to start to communicate through spoken language because of the experiences they were having. And ultimately, it resulted in them evolving their neurological circuits into what we see as anatomically modern humans. And it's interesting because what we know now from psilocybin research, for example, is that these plant medicines actually create new brain cells and they generate neurogenesis. So we do see that there is a significant amount of information gained during a psilocybin experience by the person having the experience, as well as biological changes that are happening in the brain, which show that neurogenesis is a reality.
Now, there are obviously a lot of different traditions that use sacraments in order to affect altered states of consciousness. What are some of the big ones that you've studied that you care to talk about?
Well, I think it's really important also to look at altered states of consciousness and what that means in particular, because within any given culture that speaks a certain language, there's a common understanding of people within that culture group. And then there are people who are the shamans, who are the specialists, the knowledge keepers, the priests, the doctors of any tradition. And they're really well aware of the subjectivity that their own cultural meaning projects onto the world. And they're also aware of the other worlds that exist outside of just their cultural identity and their spoken language. So we see that altered states of consciousness really applies to anybody who's using different techniques to transcend their ordinary state of reality in order to experience something that is beyond culture, or it's so personal that it goes beyond collective interpretation and becomes real in the individual reality of the experience of a person. So altered states of consciousness and the practice of altered states of consciousness are utilized from around the world to go into altered states of reality or different states of reality that are to be considered really personal or very spiritual. So it's really interesting because as I study shamanism, as I study people who use altered states of consciousness to connect with the natural world, we find a whole array of different techniques, including dancing for long periods of time, or self-mutilation, or starving themselves, fasting, going on vision quests, and spending long periods of time in nature. And we also see them using different psychedelic plant medicines as well. So there's many different ways that shamans across different cultures utilize altered states of consciousness. And since my research focus was entheogens and ethnobotany and how people utilize plants and the relationship between plants and humans, I was really interested in the psychedelic plant medicines that exist all around the world. And so universally, I was looking at different cultures and what sorts of medicines they use. We know that the Amazon basin is home to over 80,000 medicinal plants, and we see shamans in the Amazon using plants for healing different physical and spiritual ailments. And the practice of vegetalismo, or using the vegetables to heal in the Amazon basin, is very, very old. And it's a shamanic tradition that's been passed down for thousands and thousands of years. And we find really at the center of these traditions, no matter which country you go to in South America, if you're in the Amazon basin, you're going to find a huge pharmacopoeia of different natural plants that can be used in shamanic practice. So you find all different cultures utilizing many different plants primarily while using ayahuasca, which is a very famous visionary brew that's gotten a lot of attention in the last 20, 30 years. And more recently, it's really trending quite a lot. And we see a lot of tourists going to South America to experience ayahuasca shamanism. And there's a lot of stories about people and their experiences in the modern world. But we should really understand that one of the first Westerners to drink ayahuasca was Michael Harner, and he is a cultural anthropologist who went to the Amazon to research the Ivoro culture, which is a tribal culture, and that was in 1956. So he was one of the first people from the Western world to drink ayahuasca in 1956 with traditions of the Amazon rainforest, and he eventually took a really intensive study and himself became a shaman because he was initiated in the mysteries of the medicine and the traditional cultures of the Amazon. So I think Michael Harner is a really good example of an anthropologist who separated away from the university and his traditional research, and he went and did applied research in the field of ayahuasca shamanism and actually learned from the tradition keepers, the elders of the Ivoro culture, who showed him how to utilize ayahuasca, and he gained a really critical inside approach and look at how this is medicine and what the proper cultural context that ayahuasca is used in.
Interesting. So ayahuasca is just one of the plant medicine traditions that are utilized in vegetalismo. It sounds like there are many other plants that are used. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so in regards of ayahuasca traditions in the Amazon basin, there's many, many different plants that exist in the jungle that are used as medicines. And it's the shaman who studies all of these plants, who lives in the local area where these plants grow. And by consuming ayahuasca and by drinking the barks of different trees and the leaves of different shrubs, for example, they get a really strong connection to the natural world, and they begin to have communication or conversations with the spirits or the natural energies that exist in the jungle. And as a result of that, they can access forms of information that the ordinary person is not able to access. And this is because the shaman is accessing an altered state of consciousness or tapping into different vibrations of reality that exist and communicating with the plants. So actually, it's interesting to note that in many different ayahuasca traditions, it involves utilizing other plants, which are called master plants, which are plant teachers that heal and teach us through ceremonies. And a lot of these master plants, a lot of these trees or shrubs, you might drink regularly for an extended period of time in isolation in order to communicate with the plant spirit. But really, when we drink the ayahuasca, it opens up our vision and has this psychedelic, intoxicating effect that actually helps us communicate with the plant spirit and connect with the other healing energies that exist all around the practitioners in the jungle. So it's a really dynamic process, and a lot of people should know that when they drink ayahuasca, they might also be working with many other plants that the shaman has worked with in his tradition. And there's a lot of other medicines out there too than just ayahuasca when it comes to shamanism in the Amazon jungle.
So it looks like that people, at least in the United States, are searching out the ayahuasca experience. And it looks like there's a variety of ways you can have that experience. What is your recommendation if someone is a beginner, is Aya curious, but doesn't really know where to start? It looks like there are a variety of different, I guess, rituals that a person can participate in. They have a variety of different lengths, and it looks like some of them use other plant medicines as well. So if someone's curious and interested, what are your suggestions for them exploring that concept?
Well, there are so many different ayahuasca traditions. There's over 100 at least in the Amazon alone, not to mention kind of the outsource of the medicine away from the Amazon jungle and kind of the neo-shamanic implications of people that are practicing ayahuasca shamanism in the modern world. We really want to encourage people to seek out a tradition that has been kept for an extended period of time. You really want to consult a professional in regards to experiencing ayahuasca. And you really want to experience ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest because this is the original environment that the medicine lives in and has been in for thousands of years. So that's a very authentic experience and will kind of show you what the medicine is, the more traditional or the more context you'll have for the medicine if you're in the jungle, for example. So definitely you want to experience ayahuasca with somebody that you trust and you know that they're going to take care of you, because you could really open yourself up in a lot of ways that you wouldn't expect. And it could be a very, very terrifying experience or a very powerful, very strong experience. So you want to be with somebody that you can trust and has a good reputation. And you want to seek out specialists, shamans who have a lot of experience. And a lot of experience in shamanic terms is like 20, 30, 40 years of applied practice, living in the jungle, dieting different plants. This is really what gives shamans their title as shamans and specialists, because they really live and breathe the world of the plant medicine. So they really can see into other realms that the ordinary person would not be able to see. And as a result of that, the shaman can help facilitate a better healing experience and a more powerful ceremony for you in a proper way.
So you mentioned professional and you mentioned trust. How can, I guess, someone that's interested in the United States find someone that they can rely on and they can trust? What's the best way to find the correct shaman?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of different centers online. If you search on Google, ayahuasca center, Peru, for example, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, there's many different places that you could go. And I would suggest really doing a lot of research, not only on the cultural context and traditions of ayahuasca universally, but also just take a look at many different centers depending on the location that you want to travel. And you're going to want to make sure you've looked thoroughly at the different possibilities for yourself, and you'll ultimately feel a resonance with you'll feel a certain gravitation towards a place that you want to go. And you definitely would want to reach out to somebody in your community, or maybe talk to somebody on social network somewhere that can recommend a center for you based on what you're looking for. So I would definitely suggest a lot of research prior to your interest in experiencing a ceremony. And when you're going to travel to another country, you always want to make sure you take care of yourself and you go to a safe situation.
Got it. Now, you mentioned vegetalismo. Is that something that really all ayahuasca traditions do, or is it specific to perhaps like maybe the Peruvian tradition where you are dieting on specific medicinal plants prior to your ayahuasca experience?
I like to use the term vegetalismo instead of shamanism.
Mm-hmm.
And what this implies is shamans really exist all around the world in many different cultural contexts. And it's a more universal term for somebody who is a specialist of healing, of tradition, of knowledge in any given culture. And it also implies something like a very spiritual, or it's uncertain what exactly a shaman is when we say shamans or shamanism. It's not clear all the time what that means. But in the case of the Amazon jungle and the shamans, the practitioners who utilize different plants for healing, they specifically work with the plants. And it's a shamanism that's based on the plants and a spiritual connection to the plants. So we call that vegetalismo, which means that the shamans are vegetationists,
Mm-hmm.
and they utilize the plants specifically for their healing purposes. So that's a really good term to know and understand, because we want to practice plant medicine with vegetalistas, people that are experienced with the plants and they know how to prepare them to facilitate the healing of different conditions, whether they're physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual. And it's interesting to note, too, that this is only the area of the Amazon basin in South America. What I found interesting is that there are other sorts of plant medicines all around the world, in different parts of the world, too. We have the peyote medicine in Mexico, and in more modern times, it has migrated into North America with the Native American Church, and it's being utilized by many different tribes in North America as a way to connect with their ancestral teachings. And also we see Iboga and Ibogaine that comes out of Africa, and that's a whole different tradition. And Iboga is a plant with many different properties, but hallucinogenic properties nonetheless, and will give you a very powerful experience of an altered state of consciousness. And then we see shamans in Siberia using the Amenita Muscaria, different mushroom that grows in the icy terrain of Siberia. And these are really, really old traditions that have been around for a long time. And people have developed an understanding of the natural world based on what happens to their experience when they consume these hallucinogenic plants. It actually changes their perception of reality. And as a result of that, the shaman or the experienced practitioner is able to see into other realms. For example, in order to find a lost object or heal an illness or consult some form of intelligence before they make a big decision and tell their people what they should do. So no matter the plant that is being utilized, and furthermore, no matter the method that is being utilized to enter into an altered state of consciousness, people have universally been transcending their cultural reality through plant medicine or through different meditation techniques or spiritual techniques that allow them to consult with the hidden realms of reality or the spirit world. So it's kind of one big conglomeration. And what has drawn me to shamanism in particular is the cross-cultural relevance of the practice, because even though people that drink ayahuasca in the Amazon jungle and the shamans in Siberia are utilizing different medicines, different techniques, speaking a different language, in a different culture, in a different environment, and they have never had contact with each other or communication with each other, still within their own cultural context, they're reporting on experiencing similar things when they enter into a state of trance. For example, they experience the sensation of flying, or the shamanic archetype of death and rebirth. The shaman is often killed and then reborn and put back together again. And also, shamans really have special skills, such as the ability to dream or to see into different worlds. That is also a universal concept. So in my mind, there's something greater going on. There's some deeper level of information that these shamans are connecting to, whether it's in their own subconsciousness or whether it's the subconsciousness of the earth. There's no explanation. It's very mysterious.
Would it be accurate to say that these experiences have a common theme, but they're all essentially also different?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of common themes. And like I said, it's hard to explain because there's not a lot of common themes between different cultures in other sorts of traditions that you look. Cultural traditions can be very different
Mm-hmm.
from other cultures. universally, but when it comes to shamanism and sort of the reported experience of the shaman and the reported experience of somebody who goes into a trance state, they are experiencing similar things. They might be experiencing deeper levels of their own personality, transcending deeper levels of themselves, having conversations with other entities or other spirits. So this is a universal report, and it tells me that there's an aspect of reality that we don't fully understand in the Western world, and we don't actually acknowledge that in the Western world too much. There's no shamanic tradition in the Western world, and as a result of that, people in the modern times are having a really hard time connecting with the earth because we live in such a materialistic society that is separate from our original traditions and our original context of our life as humans in our natural environment.
In fact, we live in an era of prohibition, so these substances have been long reviled and people have been kept away from them, which I feel has led to this new trend of many people partaking in psychedelics without the proper set or setting, without a proper sitter. So I wanted to delve a little bit into that because it looks like there's a lot of people that order DMT online and just sit home and do some DMT. And to me, that seems like a very precarious situation, but I'm kind of curious what you think as a cultural anthropologist about that trend and whether there needs to be some more education surrounding these concepts.
Education is always so important. There's a lot of value that humans have gotten over time universally just by experimenting and trying things independently. But ultimately, we don't really want to be consuming chemicals or drugs or substances in our body that we are not familiar with and we don't know what the result is going to be. And when it comes to drugs of any sort in our modern world, there's a lot of questions as to where these chemicals come from, where these medicinal plants come from. You really need to know where the source of the substances are coming from that we are consuming and putting in our body. And we could say that about food, about drugs, about the water that we drink. We really need to know what we're putting in our body and where it comes from and the energy behind it. And so, yes, I think that if you want to have an exploration in consciousness, if you want to learn about traditional shamanic medicine, you really need to go and consult a specialist, somebody who has experience and who knows the proper application of these different medicines, because they are very powerful, they are very transformative, and there is a lot going on with the knowledge of the practice. So you want to be with somebody who is experienced and who has some level of training, because like I have said, these psychedelic medicines can really open you up and put you in a vulnerable position if you are not in the proper set or setting.
Good point. Let's get into the nuts and bolts a little bit with some of these specific psychedelics. For example, psilocybin. Is there a specific shamanic tradition that goes with psilocybin?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because we see a lot of breakthrough research in science right now regarding psilocybin mushrooms, and they're doing a lot of scientific research, and we're seeing all these scientific benefits of using psilocybin, whether that's in a high dose or in microdosing, which is also really popular nowadays. But we need to look at, where did the mushrooms come from? And it turns out they haven't been in the awareness of the Western world for very long now. Maybe it's been 70 or 80 years, actually. So it's a relatively new discovery in regards to Western civilization. And they were discovered or brought to the attention of the Western world by a man named Gordon Wasson, who traveled to Mexico in 1962 to visit a shaman down there by the name of Maria Sabina. And he had heard some leads that there was still a mushroom cult or people that worshiped mushrooms or used them in a spiritual practice. And because Gordon Wasson was a mycologist and a ethnobotanist, he wanted to see what that was about. And so he went to Mexico where he met this shaman named Maria Sabina, and she gave him psilocybin mushrooms, and she led him on a ceremony with the mushrooms. And he had a very powerful night in a traditional Mexican healing ceremony, and his life was forever changed since then. But he had no sense of where he was going and what he was doing. And because psilocybin mushrooms hadn't been discovered yet in the Western world, this was really a remarkable experience and a breakthrough experience. And interestingly enough, in the 60s, after Gordon Wasson came home from Mexico, because he was a fairly renowned scientist at the time, he reported his experience about seeing God in a traditional shamanic ceremony with the mushrooms. And there was actually an issue of Times magazine in the 60s that was published about the healing power of mushrooms and their potency. Even though it was a new discovery, a lot of scientists, therapists, and philosophically minded people were really excited about this discovery that Gordon Wasson had made because of his own experience and this sense of something new coming into the world. But it is based on an age-old tradition, and so people have been using mushrooms presumably for thousands of years, and he reports a lot of mysterious interaction between him and Maria Sabina because she knew things about his life, for example, that he never told her, and there was a lot of mysticism associated with his discovery.
Now, are psilocybin mushrooms inherently different than Amanita muscaria? Is it a different chemical component, or can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, actually, the chemical composition of Amanita muscaria and psilocybin mushrooms is completely different, and they provide different effects for the experience as well. The Amanita mushrooms are actually toxic, and you could potentially die from them, poisoning yourself fairly easily because they do have a fair amount of toxicity associated with them. Whereas psilocybin mushrooms, assuming you take mushrooms that are correctly identified, then they are very safe, and you'd have to eat more than your body weight to overdose from mushrooms. But that's not to say that both are very powerful and should be used with great care because they are extremely intense, extremely powerful, extremely transformative, and they can be very overwhelming. And if they're used in an improper way or in improper environment, you could get really in over your head, so to speak, by not being experienced.
So Amanita is the typical mushroom that you see in Alice in Wonderland, the beautiful red mushroom with the dots. Is that the correct species that I'm describing?
Yeah, that's correct. It has white dots and a red cap.
So it looks dangerous. It looks beautiful and dangerous at the same time. What is the Amanita experience like?
I've never personally had that experience, but they classify amanitas as a disassociative a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's supposed to give you a really sensation in your body and give you a sense of disillusion from ordinary cultural reality in a different way than the disillusion that's experienced with psilocybin mushrooms, which might be a more visual experience. But there's so many different factors involved with different plant medicines, and what's an interesting topic to have a discussion about is how the traditions are talking about these plant medicines in a way that is connecting with the energy of the plants spiritually. We're connecting with the spiritual energy of ayahuasca or the spiritual energy of the psilocybin mushroom. And then you have Western scientists and just the Western mindset of understanding where we're trying to quantify these things rationally and categorically according to their chemical composition, and also the dosage having an effect or not on the experience. But the shamans really universally are telling us that what's more important is that we connect with the spirit and the energy of the plant, and it's not so much related to neurology or dose in the way that we think that it is. So I believe that, we're learning a lot in Western civilization through science and our understanding and classification of these medicinal plants. And we also are learning a lot by looking at their traditions of where these medicinal plants come from. But ultimately, we need to honor the traditions in which these medicines have come to us because of the wisdom that's contained in this age-old practice. And we should know that when we're working with these powerful shamanic medicines, we're actually working with plant spirits and intelligence of some sort from the botanical dimension. And it's not just a chemical reaction that's happening in our brain. It's really a energy of consciousness and a communion of consciousness between our own being and maybe our subconscious or the consciousness of the earth itself. So it's really hard to believe some of the experiences that you can have with different plant medicines, and the people that have the experiences are really able to share and discuss and communicate what that experience is like to each other. But if you've never had an experience with different psychedelic plant medicines, you might never be able to really understand what other people are talking about, because it's such a personal experience, and really bizarre phenomenon can happen in regards to hallucinations auditorily or visually, or different healing that can take place in a ceremonial setting. So there's a lot of factors involved, and I think we're learning more that set and setting is so important. The context in which the medicine is taken is so important. But really, there's no guarantees, because we know from experiencing ayahuasca in the jungle that somebody who drinks 20 milliliters of ayahuasca can have a very powerful experience, and the person sitting next to him in ceremony could drink 3 times that amount of ayahuasca and not feel anything. So there's a lot of uncertainties, and I don't think it's just a dosage and pharmacology sort of issue. I think there are other unseen realms that we're confronting when we utilize these medicines. And we know that. I know that as an anthropologist by talking with different traditions and different cultures that are essentially communicating with spirits or the spirit world or these other healing energies that exist in the plant medicines and the healing essence of nature in itself.
What's interesting is that it seems like it's a common theme that the majority of people that have done these plant medicines believe that they have encountered a plant spirit or a different consciousness that has communicated with them. So this seems to be a theme. And from what I'm hearing, it's a universal theme. It seems like it's been reported across different cultures. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a theme that's universal and reoccurring. I think a lot of the experiences that people are having in their shamanic ceremonies that are very mystical, mysterious, otherworldly, are similar to the experiences that people had thousands of years ago. And we can sort of look at the great timeline of history and what's been recorded and preserved in oral traditions. We can understand that people have been having these experiences for many thousands of years with and without plants. And there are other different poles in our reality that make it so we can see that reality itself is very mysterious and we don't know all the answers.
Now, it sounds like with the majority of these traditions, they're done in conjunction with a shaman, and typically they're done in a group setting. However, peyote seems to be one of those traditions that definitely encourages a solo experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Peyote is a really old medicine that's been around for thousands of years, and it started, as far as we know, being utilized in central Mexico by the Huchal culture, group of Mexican Indians who have utilized peyote for a long, long time. And their culture reflects peyote as being the centerpiece of their life. They regard peyote, corn, deer, and God all as the same substance. So
Interesting.
they worship God and corn as giving them life, and peyote as giving them medicine, and the deer as the animals and the identity of the Huchal people and the context of their life on the earth. So it really gives them a place of meaning on the earth as their sacred land in Mexico. And on their sacred land, they have this peyote medicine, which gives them access to communication with very powerful healing energies and God or the creator. So when westernization was happening and colonization was happening in North America, we had the displacement of many indigenous people and Native Americans in North America, and there was a large cultural genocide that was happening between the pioneers and the expansion of America westward, and the indigenous people who have lived in North America for thousands of years that were suddenly being taken away from their native lands. So there was a lot of struggle and conflict between the cowboys and Indians, and it was a really, really hard time for the native people in North America. And we're still living with some of the ramifications of that. So the peyote medicine was brought from Mexico to North America in the later part of the 1800s, and it was brought to tribal leaders of Native American traditions from the Huchal Indians because the native people were really looking for some way that they could help their people through these genocides and massive tragedies of the loss of their cultural identity. So people like Geronimo, for example, were utilizing peyote in the early times in conjunction with the Huchal Indians, bringing it back into North America. And this was a way for the Native Americans to use the peyote to connect with their indigenous culture, their traditions, their stories, their prayer songs, and also the sacredness of the medicine that was being shown to them, which really provides the people with a direct connection to the creator. So in the later part of the 1800s, the peyote was being spread across North America and was being utilized in Native American healing ceremonies. And what is now called the Native American Church has developed in North America among many different tribes. And the Native American Church is a branch of religion or spirituality that encompasses many different North American Native traditions. And it all centers around their practice of using peyote in a traditional healing ceremony. So it's a way, the medicine is a way for the people to come together and do a night-long healing and reconnect with their tribal identity through their prayer songs and their native language as well. So we still see peyote use quite a lot in North America through the Native American Church. And although these North American Native traditions never traditionally used peyote, they started using peyote maybe in like the 1880s or the early 1900s. So now the tradition has been established, but it's not a long-standing tradition that's been around for thousands of years. It's kind of a more modern tradition that was brought into being by the synergy of different cultures. A lot of what we're seeing universally across the world, for example, now with modern science and Western culture and the interest of revitalizing these natural medicines, which happen to have a history of thousands of years of use.
Now, the active ingredient in peyote seems to be mescaline, which is also the active ingredient in San Pedro. Are those experiences similar, different? How do they compare?
That's another interesting topic to bring up. A lot of Western pharmacology and just the Western understanding of how drugs work and how different alkaloids are contained in different plants and what effect those alkaloids have on our neurochemistry. I mean, that's what chemistry is, and that's the classification of science and pharmacology in the modern world. So when we say that peyote has mescaline in it, yes, that's true. But what also should be noted is that not only does peyote have mescaline, but peyote has at least 100 other alkaloids similar to mescaline, but different. So actually, when you're consuming peyote or San Pedro, for example, both of these medicines have mescaline alkaloids in them, but it's not just pure mescaline alkaloids. It's actually hundreds of different alkaloids working together within your body to generate a certain form of healing or a certain experience. So what I find as I research different plants from around the world and the traditional application and maximizing the application of different natural treatments, we should be looking at utilizing full plant medicines for the full benefit, because quite literally the creator brought to life these plants, and as a result of that, the plants are here to heal humanity, and we don't want to alter them too much from their original design so as to start extracting alkaloids and synthesizing semi-synthetic materials. We should really be honoring the natural context in which the medicine is consumed and generated. So it's really interesting to note that and have that discussion. And with regard to peyote and San Pedro, both are cacti and both contain mescaline, but they also contain hundreds of different alkaloids, each uniquely different to their own, which gives both of those experiences a similar sort of feeling and overlap, but also a very different feeling as well, because they are different plants and they do have a different plant spirit. So again, it's most important to be looking at these plant medicines and thinking about them in a spiritual context and how we can connect to the energy of the plant spiritually, rather than how we are just consuming a combination of alkaloids and the effect that that has. There's a much deeper connection and a deeper awareness involved with connecting with the shamanic plants.
What are your thoughts on frog medicine? I know it comes from, I think, locally to where you're from, right? Arizona, but I'm not aware of any deep-rooted cultural traditions that are associated with that. So any thoughts about that?
Oh, yeah, you're talking about Bufo alvaris,
Correct.
the Sonoran toad. It grows in northern Mexico and southern Arizona in the Sonoran Desert. And it's a toad that secretes 5-MeO-DMT from its skin. So you can kind of touch its skin at a certain time of the season and it will excrete a white liquid. And what that is 5-MeO-DMT. So people extract the secretion of the toad and dry it out, and then they go ahead and they smoke the toad venom, and they have a very powerful DMT experience where they completely lose touch with ordinary reality and then go into an altered state of consciousness where they have a powerful visionary experience. They transcend different levels of reality. They see God. They communicate with different entities. There's a lot that can go on during that experience. And I'm not aware of a tradition that incorporates that toad medicine, although I do know that there are different native groups in Mexico that utilize the toad medicine currently. And some of the people that are interested in experiencing the bufo toad should be looking in northern Mexico, because there are different tribes there that have utilized this medicine for at least a good amount of time. I'm not sure how long the tradition goes in the historical or archaeological record, but certainly I do know that there is a big interest in bufo and the healing effects that the experience can provide, which is quite different than a frog, which comes from South America, which is called cambo or sapo in Peru.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a frog as opposed to a toad. And they would, this frog would secrete a venom, and the practitioner will take some of this venom off of the toad and scrape it onto a stick, and then burn your arm slightly and put some of the venom on your arm to allow the venom to be absorbed topically on your skin. And it has a lot of benefits for boosting your immune system. And it's a blood mover, so it moves all the blood that's deep in your organs, which is not normally circulated. And it'll circulate all the blood around in your body, so it cleanses your blood and helps you move objects that might be stuck in your digestive tract, or different stones that have built up from the toxins in your liver. Things like that can be a really powerful cleanse and a purgative. So it's really interesting how frogs have this medicine, both the toad,
Mm-hmm.
which is a powerful visionary experience, and then also the cambo, which is a physical cleansing experience, but also does have spiritual properties as well.
So it looks like there's a lot of benefit, and a person that's interested in exploring needs to see what resonates with them. Would that be a accurate statement?
Yeah, that's really the best thing that we can say for anybody in any given situation. You know, ultimately, we are guided by our intuition, and we're called towards certain practices, certain experiences in our life. And we want to really feel a resonance with what it is that we are undertaking in our life, what it is that we feel like we want to experience. And it's especially true, I think, with these powerful plant medicines, because they operate at a spiritual level and they operate in the subtle levels of consciousness. So I believe there's a lot of unseen forces involved when somebody feels called towards a certain type of shamanic ceremony or a certain type of plant medicine, because there's a spiritual component to that. And I think that following through with some of the deeper spiritual callings that people have and feel in their own life is a way that we can transcend our ordinary life and step into the aspect of our consciousness that is connected with mystery and wonder and imagination.
Now, you mentioned ibogaine earlier, and I know that ibogaine has been successfully used for, um, weaning off drugs and alcohol addiction. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the cultural tradition that's associated with that?
Yeah, so ibogaine is actually a synthetic derivative or an alkaloid extraction from Iboga, which is itself a traditional shamanic medicine. And the Iboga tradition comes from Africa in a tribe called the Bwiti. And the Bwiti are a really old group of people who have been around for a long time with a great shamanic tradition. and a ritual that involves the Iboga plant. And Iboga is a very powerful plant medicine, a very powerful hallucinogen, and it's taken in the Bwiti culture as something like an initiation rite for a boy to become a man, or in a variety of different healing ceremonies would somebody need to utilize Iboga. And it involves a lot of preparation. They spend weeks or years or even their entire life preparing for their Iboga ceremony, and that involves many different shamanic treatments, including special songs and special timing in your life to when it's appropriate for you to be able to participate in an Iboga ceremony. And you have to do a variety of different fasts and dieting and restrict yourself to certain lifestyle conditions during your process of connecting with the Iboga medicine. And they say that all the ancestors are in the Iboga. So when you experience the Iboga and you drink cups and cups of this really horrible tasting tree bark, you will essentially go into an altered state of consciousness that could last anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. And you're not really able to move your body very much at all during this period. And it can be a very overwhelming psychedelic experience. And during this time, the practitioner is entering the spirit world, communicating with the spirit of Iboga, and also communicating with ancestors who have died long ago or who are here to show the person in the shamanic trance something about their life. So we see now people taking Iboga and extracting ibogaine out of it, one of the psychedelic alkaloids. And we see a lot of different healing centers around the world, particularly in Costa Rica and Mexico. And these are inpatient rehabilitation centers for people that have drug addiction. They go and they get a dose of ibogaine, and the effects last 24 hours or so, and the person has a psychedelic experience involving ibogaine, and the spirit of ibogaine and the transcendental healing that it brings can be really beneficial for breaking the patterns of addiction and some of the subconscious blocks that cause addiction in the first place. And what's particularly interesting about Iboga and ibogaine is that it's really helpful for people that have opiate addiction and opiate dependency, because the opiate receptors in our brain really, when you get addicted to opiates, the opiate receptors in your brain get continually occupied. And when you stop consuming opiates, the neurological system is missing the opiates in the brain, and therefore you have withdrawal symptoms and you go through a series of unbearable physical pain and all sorts of discomfort. But when you take the Iboga or the ibogaine, after the experience, the Iboga actually binds to your opiate receptors for about 30 days after the experience, which means that if you've been taking opiates up until your Iboga experience, you have your Iboga experience, the neurological imprint of opiates are still being fulfilled in your brain, and you are not having withdrawal symptoms, because the ibogaine is the bridge between yourself and sort of breaking your cycle through your connection to opiates and your opioid receptors.
Amazing. Well, we would be remiss if we don't talk about cannabis and its shamanic tradition. Can you talk a little bit about the, I guess, tradition that has been associated with the use of cannabis, particularly in the native culture?
Yeah, cannabis is a very interesting plant. It's been around for a really long time, and there's a lot that we can discuss with regard to cannabis, and particularly how it works in the human brain and its role in human evolution, because humans and all mammals, for that matter, have evolved on Earth with an endocannabinoid system. And these are different neurological imprints that mammals have that are responsible for feeling of being tired or hungry or sleepy or lazy or happy or many of these different day-to-day survival mechanisms that we feel and these sensations that we feel actually come through the regulation of our endocannabinoid system. And so what we see is that many different mammals have an endocannabinoid system, and there happens to be a plant called cannabis that contains cannabinoids that we can actually consume outside of our body. And what's really interesting about cannabis is that it has a cannabinoid called THC, among with hundreds of other alkaloids in cannabis, other cannabinoids that all occupy our neurological endocannabinoid system. But THC itself has its own unique receptor in our brain, specifically for the ingestion or the biological synergy that happens when the human brain ingests THC from the cannabis plant, because humans cannot produce THC on their own, but we have a neurological receptor for THC, should we choose to consume THC through the marijuana plant. So it's really interesting evolutionary topic, because we wonder what came first, the endocannabinoid system or the cannabis plant. How did a receptor evolve in the human brain that evolved separately in the natural world in the form of a plant? So I think it's interesting to note that many of the most powerful psychedelics, DMT, psilocybin, and cannabis, all contain alkaloids that are very, very similar to neurological alkaloids, and there's almost no difference between the chemistry that's happening in our brain and the plant that we're consuming. So cannabis is a really great medicine that's been around a long, long time, and it was first documented in Chinese medicine and some of the herbs in China that was being classified historically about 2,000 years ago. I believe they said at that time that cannabis is something like a adaptogen, and it relieves what ails you, and it can heal inflammation and pain and all these different problems that come from just being alive on the day-to-day. So it has a long historical context as a medicine, and we also know that it was used in India for a long, long time with the yogis there who are devotees of the Lord Shiva, one of the gods in Hinduism, and Shiva is contained in the plant of cannabis. So when the devotees or the yogis are praying to Shiva, they are smoking cannabis religiously, and it alters their consciousness into a non-ordinary state of consciousness where they can go into these powerful spiritual experiences. So we have cannabis use showing up in India pretty religiously, quite literally, as a form of religious practice. And then also in Jamaica and Africa, we see Rastafarian traditions, people that have a strong connection to the natural earth and a strong connection to the creator through using cannabis religiously. And the Rastafarians are people who have a spiritual connection to the creator and the powerful life force essence of the creator. And Rastafarians are philosophical, astrological interpreters, priests, fortune tellers, and religious devotees of creation. And they utilize cannabis as a doorway to enter into these worlds of knowledge and experience.
Interesting. Well, fascinating conversation. Thank you, Anthony, for jumping on. This was truly just an overview of some of the major entheogens, and the purpose was to really educate people about what's out there and what the different traditions were. I know you have this great podcast, the Hour of Truth radio show, And perhaps if people are more interested to find out more in depth about some of your work and some of your studies, they can tune into that. We'll go ahead and make sure that the link is provided in the show notes. Wanted to say if you had any closing comments.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show, Taya. I'm really love what I do as a researcher, sharing some of the traditions associated with holistic healing and spiritual healing, because I really believe that shamanic traditions have a great key to understanding humans and humanity's natural connection to the world that we live in, because the more that we understand our connection to all of our relations, the earth, fire, water, and air, and the actual context of our birth on this earth, connection to our family and our ancestors, then we will have a greater fulfillment of our life and a greater purpose as we live every day. So I really do believe that plants hold a big key to our connection to the natural world and to our understanding of the natural world and our place in the natural world. So if you want to listen to my podcast, it's called the Aura of Truth Radio Show, and you can find that at soundcloud.com/aura of truth. And you can also send a message to me through SoundCloud, and you can find me on Instagram at Aura of Truth as well. So I really look forward to any discussions, feedback, and if there's anything else that I could do for anybody, please be in communication and let me know.
Thank you, Anthony. We really appreciate all the information and all your time, and I look forward to picking up this conversation at a later point.
Thank you so much, Taya. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.